Welcome, brave listener. We're delighted you've joined us. Prepare for tales crafted for true connoisseurs of fear. They'll linger long after we part, transporting you to places others flee. Settle in, if you dare. Story 1. This is not my story. It is my daughter S. Her name was Teresa. She died 2 weeks ago. A suicide by overdose. She called me just prior to the act, informing me of her intentions and the reasons behind them. I, of course, pled with her, begging her through tears not to go through with what she had planned, but she was resolute in her decision. And with growing horror, I realized that this was no bluff, no desperate cry for attention or reassurance. As she hung up the phone, I knew with certainty she was already as good as dead. I knew it from the moment she had said, "Daddy, Ray is here." I immediately phoned the police, knowing that they would be able to reach her well before I could. But I also knew they would be too late. They found her in bed, by all appearances in a deep and peaceful sleep, one hand draped across her stomach, the other outstretched to the side, palm up, fingers curled, as if clutching something, another hand perhaps. But the other side of the bed, Ray S. side, was empty. This is also Ray S. story. He died a little more than a year before Teresa did. He was shot twice, once through his right hand, which he had held out defensively. The bullet piercing both his cell phone and his palm before lodging in the tile of the wall of the bathroom, in which he had made a final desperate attempt to hide. The second bullet found his neck, and he bled out quickly, alone on the cold floor. He was one of 9 people who died in his office building that day. 8 of those people thought it was just another Monday at work, unaware that they would not be walking out alive at the end of the day, the 9th to die. The shooter had no intention of walking out again. Ray had called Teresa on his lunch break that day. She was at home, and the sight of his name lighting up her cell and causing it to buzz had made her smile. Married only 3 months, the pair was still in that young, fleeting honeymoon stage of marriage, and Ray would frequently find any excuse to phone his bride from work if time allowed. "Hello," she answered, a smile in her voice. Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work? Ray said. "I don't know," Teresa responded. Why did he? Because he was stuck in a vicious cycle. Ray said Teresa chuckled. The joke wasn't he really all that funny? But Ray had always delighted in corny humor, and his joy in telling these awful jokes brought Teresa more pleasure than the punchline itself. Case in point, he had used a ridiculous pickup line to win her over in the first place. "Feel my shirt," he had said to her. a stranger in a sea of people crammed into a mixer at one of her girlfriend S apartments 2 years ago. You know what it's made of. Boyfriend material. Teresa had laughed out loud. 1, because the pickup line was genuinely funny, and 2, because Ray, tall and attractive in a goofy kind of way, was so ridiculously happy to use it on her. His smile contagious and immediately endearing. And as bad as the line had been, it had worked. They had been together ever since. How is your day? Teresa said, sitting down at the kitchen table, living the dream. Ray responded with some sarcasm. Actually, my presentation went well this morning. I am supposed to present it again to senior staff on Wednesday. Things are looking promising. That's great news, Teresa said. It really is, Ray said, satisfaction in his voice. You know, if this proposal goes through, we should celebrate. Go away somewhere. There was a pause on Ray's end. That sounds like a wonderful idea, he responded. Only now he sounded slightly distracted. You have some place in mind? I don't know, Teresa said, thinking. Cheryl has that cabin that she said we were always welcome to use. We ought to take her up on that sometime. She and Brad will end up selling it before we ever use it. It would be nice to get away. Ray, didn't he respond? Babe. Teresa said a moment's hesitation. Did you hear that? Ray asked. Hear what? Teresa said. But before he could respond, she heard it. A loud report, a distant bang, coming over the phone. Ray, what was that? I don't know, he said. And from the sound of his voice, he was walking. His voice sounded shaky. Ray. There was a second loud report, still distant, but closer. And Teresa felt her hands go cold when she thought she heard a woman scream. I am going to find out what's going on, Ray said. I'll call you back, Ray, Teresa said. But he was gone. She set the cell phone down on the table and stared at its black screen. She got up suddenly from the kitchen table, walked to the sink, and filled a glass with water, which she downed, staring over at the phone. She willed it to ring again, to show Ray's name. It did not. Teresa rushed over and picked it up. She called Ray's cell phone. It went to voicemail. She called his desk phone. It too went to voicemail. She called reception at his office. No answer. She slammed the phone back down on the table. Hands trembling. She found it hard to catch her breath. To not imagine the worst. To convince herself that what she had heard did not mean what she thought it meant. An interminable moment later, her phone rang. She snatched it up. Ray, she said. Baby, he said, whispering, his tone urgent. There's a man with a gun. Teresa sank into the chair. Where are you? She asked. Whispering too, without realizing she was. I am in a bathroom down the hall from my office. Reese, he killed Mark. I saw it happen. His voice was trembling, on the verge of tears or panic. Ray, hang up and call the police, she said. I beeped it beep, he insisted. They on their way. Okay, she said. Just be calm. She said this as much to herself as she said it to Ray. Where is Beep asked. I don't know, he said. I saw him at the end of the hallway. I saw him shoot Mark. I came in here because it was the closest door. I don't know if he saw me. Did you lock the door? She asked. The door doesn't lock, he said, a small sob hitching in his voice. I am in one of the stalls. It has locked. Teresa began to cry silently. The hopelessness of Ray S. situation sinking in. Who is Beep asked. I don't know. He S. wearing a mask. A ski mask. I think he S. Ray stopped talking suddenly at the sound of a loud bang. Disturbingly close. Ray hesitated and took a long, shaking breath. I love you, Reese, he whispered. His voice even quieter now, barely audible. No, she objected, and she slid from the chair to the kitchen floor. The phone pressed tight to her ear there was another banging sound. But this time it wasn't the report from a gun. It was the sound of a door being kicked open and hitting a wall. Ray took a sudden, gasping breath. Ray. Teresa, whispered Beep, bang beep. The sound of the door of a bathroom stall being kicked. No. Ray cried out, and the sound of his desperation made Teresa's entire body go numb. Ray. Teresa said, louder beep, bang beep. The sound of the stall door crashing open. Beep, no. Beep, Ray screamed. Ray. Teresa yelled beep, bang beep. The sound of a gun. And then everything was silent in the house for several seconds as Teresa struggled to take in a breath. Finally, she screamed the shooter was a man named Vincent Holland. He had worked in the engineering department just one floor down from Ray S. office in marketing, a textbook disgruntled employee with manic depressive issues. At least, that was the story that the press was reporting. Vincent had managed to beep 8 of his coworkers, and then had turned the gun on himself at the first sound of approaching sirens. The following 24 hours were a blur for Teresa through a haze of shock. She had answered police questions, had identified her husband's body, his face pale, but still unmistakably his own, and had made necessary phone calls to friends and family. And in the moments between, Teresa had wept, her body crushed under the weight of a grief that was nearly unbearable. The physical pain of it enough to make her welcome the thought that perhaps it might beep her. Beep, what a mercy that would beep, she thought. The night of Ray S. death, she had slept the deep and artificial sleep of the drugged, her body succumbing to whatever cocktail her best friend Cheryl had insisted on giving her. Teresa had not asked, did not even care what the pills were, but had taken them all and quickly slipped into the warm embrace of sleep, where her grief, at least briefly, could not reach her when she woke the next day. She wondered briefly why her chest hurt so badly. It took but a moment for her to remember, and the tears were immediate. She rolled over and put her palm on Ray S.'s side of the bed, where the mattress was cold and empty. Behind the sound of her crying, she could hear voices down the hallway. Cheryl and Teresa, S. mother, were speaking in somber tones. Teresa looked at the clock. It was shortly after noon. Cheryl S.'s sleeping pills had caused her to sleep for more than 11 hours. Teresa sat up in bed and wiped the tears from her cheeks, consciously pressing the sorrow down deep into her stomach. She picked up her cell phone from the nightstand, more out of habit than necessity, and shuffled toward the bathroom, flipping a switch. The light assaulted her eyes, and for a moment she absorbed her own pitiful reflection. Eyes swollen, cheeks splotchy, nose red. She took in a long, shaking breath then. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she jumped. The screen said. Ray Teresa stared at it. A mixture of disbelief and confusion coursing through her brain. She answered it. Hello. Her voice was barely a croak. Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work? Ray said. Teresa struggled to take a breath, and when she was finally able, it came in a rattling gasp. She took an involuntary step away from the mirror, as if retreating from what she was hearing. Her mind raced as she felt a sudden surge of hope warring against her lingering sorrow, and she wondered if perhaps the events of yesterday had been nothing but an incredible dream, because he was stuck in a vicious cycle. Ray concluded. Ray, Teresa said. Yeah, baby. He responded. What's wrong? The joke wasn't beep that beep bad. Ray, where are you? She asked. I am at work, he said with a slight chuckle. Just got out of a meeting. My presentation went well. I am supposed to present it again to senior staff on Wednesday. Things are looking promising. Teresa, didn't he respond? Reese, are you okay? He asked. Teresa looked at herself in the mirror, at her Halloween mask of grief. The floor felt like it was tilting under her, and her brain, still kicking off the last remnants of Cheryl S. pills, was a swamp of conflicting thoughts. Reese, he said again. What day is this? She asked. What? It's Monday, he said. What's going on? What's wrong? It's Tuesday, she said. "Know it as Ray began." But then he stopped. There was silence on both ends of the phone for a moment. Then Ray said, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked. Then she heard it, and a sick feeling of déjà vu swept through her. There was a loud report, a distant bang coming over the phone. What beep was beep that? Ray said, and from the sound of his voice, he was walking. "Ray, wait." Teresa said there was another loud report, still distant but closer. And Teresa heard a woman scream. "I am going to find out what's going on," Ray said. "I'll call you back." Beep Don T. Beep Teresa said. But he was gone. Teresa put her phone down on the bathroom sink and stared down at it, her hair cascading in front of her eyes. She shook her head violently, trying to shake off the confusion that made it difficult for her to focus. She ran her fingers through her hair and then pulled at it in frustration. She picked her phone back up and called Ray S. cell. Voicemail. She called his desk phone. Voicemail. She called reception at his office. The outgoing message informed her that in light of yesterday's tragic events, the office would be closed for the remainder of the week. Teresa furrowed her brow and put the phone down on the sink again seconds later. It rang again. The screen said. Reishi answered it without saying anything. "Reese," Ray said, his voice whispering panic. "Listen to me. There's a man with a gun." Teresa began to sob, and her hand shook so violently that she could barely hold the phone to her ear. "I am in the bathroom, down the hall from my office. Baby, he killed Mark. I saw it happen." Ray's voice trembled. On the verge of tears, Teresa said nothing. "I called the police," Ray continued. "They were on their way." He took a long, trembling breath. Teresa sat down on the floor and brought her knees up to her chest. She began to rock back and forth. "I don't know where he is now," Ray said. "I saw him at the end of the hallway. I saw him shoot Mark. I came in here because it was the closest door. I don't know if he saw me, but the door doesn't lock. I am in one of the stalls." There was a long moment of silence. "Reese, beep-tick-beep to me," Ray demanded desperately. "Ray," she said through her sobs. She could manage no more words than that. "I don't know who this guy is," Ray said. "He wearing a mask. A ski mask. I think he is." But Ray stopped talking suddenly at the sound of a loud bang, disturbingly close. He hesitated and took a long, shaking breath. "I love you, Reese," he whispered over the phone. Teresa heard the sound of a door being kicked open and hitting a wall. Ray gasped. Teresa relived the sound of the bathroom stall door being kicked open, the sound of Ray's desperate objection, and then the final sound of the gun being fired and in the ensuing silence, Teresa relived the grief of her husband, S. death. For the second time she told no one about the call. Not Cheryl, and not her mother. She couldn't explain it to herself, much less to anyone else. The two had continued to keep her company throughout the day, answering phone calls, dealing with concerned well-wishers, attempting to get Teresa to eat, and managing the details of Ray S. viewing and funeral, which were scheduled for Saturday evening and Sunday morning, respectively. But mostly, the two of them were there simply to make sure that Teresa was not alone. In her waking moments, they treated her like an antique porcelain doll. Delicate and fragile Teresa slept for most of the day. Even without Cheryl S. chemical help, she ate hardly at all, a fact that distressed her mother. She had still been in bed at noon on the following day, Wednesday, 2 days after Ray S. death, when her cell phone rang. The screen said, Ray. Her body went numb, and she quietly began to cry. She answered it. Ray, she said quietly, why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work? He said. Teresa ended the call immediately, and then shut her phone off completely and tossed it aside. She lay in bed and wept on the third day, Thursday. Teresa was alone in the house. Cheryl and her mother had other things to attend to, and hadn't been outside the house since Monday evening. Teresa had showered, brushed her hair, and even put on a bit of makeup. Her arms felt weak and heavy as she did so, but she attempted a tired smile as she insisted that she would be fine if her mom and best friend left her alone for a little while when her cell phone rang shortly after noon. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the bright sunlight through the windows making her head ache. After so much time spent in the darkness of her bedroom, she answered it, her voice weak, because he was stuck in a vicious cycle. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment Teresa wondered if Ray was really there finally. He laughed and asked, "How did you do that?" "I am not sure," she said. "Are you okay?" He asked. "You sound strange." Teresa took a deep breath. "Do you know who Vincent Holland is?" she asked. "Yeah. He works down in engineering, I think. I don't know him real well. I do know that every day at lunch he eats an onion like an apple. Never seen anything like it. Ray, he has a gun," Teresa said. "What? How do you know that?" "Don T asked me that right now," she responded. "He has a gun, and he's going to start shooting people. You have to get out." "Reese, I don't." But then Ray stopped, as they both heard the sound of a gun being fired. What was that? "Listen to me," Teresa said. "You have to get out of the building." Ray was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, I am going." And then the phone fell, silent Teresa put the phone on the table and stared at it. Dust floated silently through a sunbeam that cascaded through the window and landed with warmth on the back of her hand. She wondered how the sun continued to shine, as if the entire world Wasson-T enveloped in grief, like she was her phone, rang again. Reishi answered. "Baby, I saw him," Ray whispered. "Where are you?" she asked. "I am in the bathroom, down the hall from my office. Baby, he killed Mark." Teresa ended the call and slammed her phone back down on the table. She put her hands over her eyes and cried Friday. Shortly after noon, Teresa sat at the kitchen table with Cheryl and her mother. The three of them were quietly nursing cups of tea, the kitchen counters, and nearly every other available surface covered in gift baskets and flowers. Teresa S. mother and Cheryl made quiet small talk as Teresa sat silently, her eyes intently focused on her cell phone, which sat like a dumb blank slate on the table in front of her. Point 123 came and went without a call. Teresa chuckled mirthlessly to herself. She had intentionally made sure she was not alone for today's phone call from Ray. If he did call again, this time she wanted witnesses, but part of her knew that he would not call her if she was not alone. "Is everything okay, Reese?" Cheryl asked Teresa, peeled her eyes away from the silent phone. "Yes," she whispered, and sipped her tea. I flew in from across country for Ray S. viewing and funeral. Teresa S. mother and I were cordial toward each other, but also avoided each other as much as possible for Teresa S. sake. I was shocked at how she looked tired and haggard and grief-stricken, of course, but also troubled in a way that did not look like simple mourning. I held her tightly several times over the course of those 2 days, always at a loss for words, wishing there was anything in the world I could do to remove the weight of sorrow pressing on her shoulders. Teresa told me later that she had tucked her phone away during those 2 days of activities. She had thought that maybe going through the ceremony of remembering Ray S. life, seeing his serene face as he lay dead in his casket, and then watching with surprising detachment as his body was lowered into the ground, would bring a final end to his daily calls. But on Monday, alone at home for only the second time in the week since Ray had died, her phone rang again. She considered not answering it, but could not resist doing so. A sense of both longing and hopelessness in her chest. "Ray," she said, "why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?" Ray said, and Teresa burst into tears for the next several days. Teresa lived in a fog. She always took Ray S. call. Some days, she let the conversation play out like it had on the first day. relishing those first fleeting seconds when Ray was still happy and alive. Other days, she interrupted his joke in order to ask him a question, like where he had put the key to the safety deposit box, or where he had filed insurance papers. Confused but cooperative, Ray always answered her questions. Some days, she had used those initial seconds to convey her deep love for him, and she had sobbed as he had expressed his love for her in return. But then, all too quickly, the sound of a gun would bring their conversation to an abrupt end. Then one day, weeks on, the phone had rung, and Teresa had said, "Hello, baby," and waited for Ray to launch into his bicycle joke. There was a pause, and Ray had said, "Reese did I call you earlier today?" A coldness spread through Teresa's chest that she couldn't understand. What? No, you didn't beep so strange, Ray said. I picked up the phone to call you and got this sudden sense of déjà vu, like I already called you today. A tear fell silently down Teresa's cheek. She couldn't find words. Is everything okay? Ray asked. I miss you, baby, she whispered. Ray chuckled. I miss you too, he responded, more of a question than a statement. I'll see you in a few hours. Know you one tea, she said. Reese, what? And then he stopped. Did you hear that? Teresa hung up the phone. Her thoughts stirred with confusion and an odd sense of hope. Every prior conversation had been laden with a heavy sense of the inevitable. No matter what Teresa said to him, Ray would always end up dead on the floor of his office bathroom. But today, he had seemed to remember something, and their conversation had taken a different course at Ray's direction, and Teresa began to wonder what would happen if she tried pushing harder, made more of an effort to get Ray to take a different course of action. The next day, when Ray called, Teresa immediately took charge of the conversation. Ray, I need you to listen to me carefully and answer me as fast as you can. How many different ways are there out of your office, out of your department? I mean, what? He said. Answer me, she insisted. There's the main door. Straight through goes to the IT department, and to the left takes me down the main hallway. There's a second door that goes through HR, but that just meets up with the main hallway at the other end. And then there's the door to the balcony. Why are you asking me this? Grab your keys. Don't grab anything else, Teresa insisted. Go through the IT department. Do beep nit beep. Go down the hall. Get to your car. And beep come home beep. Beep no beep. There was a pause. And then Ray said, Okay, I am coming. And the line went. Dead Teresa found herself out of breath while she waited. She paced. Moments later, her phone rang again. Reese, listen to me. There's a man with a gun. Teresa screamed in frustration and threw her phone across the room, where it hit the carpet and slid across the floor. The next time he called, Teresa asked, Ray, the balcony outside your department, does it have steps that go down to the courtyard? Yes, he said. Why do you ask? And you can get to the parking lot from there. Yes. What is going on? Go, Teresa insisted. Don't ask me anything. Just go out the balcony doors and to your car. Do it now. Come home. Is everything okay? He asked. Beep go bep, she yelled, and hung up the phone. A minute passed, then two. Teresa barely breathed as she stared at her phone. 5 minutes passed without a call from Ray. She was finally able to take a breath. Teresa was on her bed. Her back ached as she sat arched over her phone. For the first time since the day he died, there was no second phone call. And Teresa had no idea what to expect next. She was lost in a nearly thoughtless daze when she heard the front door open. She jumped and nearly cried out. The door closed and she heard footsteps. She jumped from the bed, racing from the bedroom and down the hallway to the foyer, and, impossibly, there he was, his tall, gangly, goofy-looking yet handsome self. Although his skin was deathly pale to the point of almost being blue, he smiled at her. Although his brow was furrowed in concern, his mouth formed the beginnings of a question. But she ran to him and leapt into his arms. He was cold, deathly cold, and Teresa gasped. Is everything okay? He asked, and his voice sounded like it did on mornings when he had first woken up, rattling and unused. Everything is okay now, Teresa said, weeping into his shoulder, holding him tighter than she ever had before, and in return, Ray held her tightly as well, but his hands were like ice on her back, his body stiff against hers. And although her ear was pressed firmly against his chest, she could not feel his heart beating, a fact that she dismissed just as quickly as she realized it. Teresa decided to tell him everything, sitting at the kitchen table. She held his icy hand in both of hers as she recounted everything from the initial shooting at Ray's office, his death, his funeral, and his daily phone calls. He stared at her blankly, his face registering no alarm, confusion, or even recollection as she spoke. She sat back in her chair and considered him for a moment. Beep tabula rasa. Beep, she thought dully. As she looked at him, he wasn't hungry. He wasn't thirsty. He was content to sit quietly until Teresa gave him directions to move. Her heart ached with the dueling emotions of relief and terrible confusion, and she watched him closely, unable to hide the bewilderment on her face. And yet, Ray never asked her what was wrong that evening. Teresa led Ray to their bedroom, where he stood dully by the foot of the bed and looked at her as if he had never been in the room before. She undressed him, and as she did so, she realized he was wearing his work clothes, not the suit he had been buried in the suit he had worn on their wedding day. She pulled back the covers and told him to lie down. He did so. With silent obedience, she slid in beside him and kissed him. His kiss was both familiar and foreign to her. His lips were soft and passive, where they had always been firm and insistent before, and there was no warmth there, but the texture and the taste of him was the same, and Teresa nearly wept as they embraced again. They made love, Teresa initiating and leading where Ray had always taken charge before. And while her heart overflowed with the joy of being held by her husband once more, her body shivered at the iciness of his touch when Teresa awoke the next morning. Sunlight touching her eyelids, she reached out without opening her eyes, but her fingers encountered nothing. Ray S. side of the bed was empty, the covers pulled up as if he had never been there. She sat up abruptly. "Ray," she called out. There was no answer. She searched the house, calling out for him several times, but he was gone. She returned to the bedroom, feeling both confused and sorrowful. Where had he gone? And would he come back? And then, shortly after noon, her phone rang. The screen said, "Ray." She answered it. "Ray." "Reese," he said, his voice sounding even more raspy and unused than before. "Don't worry. I know there's a shooter. I am coming home." The line went dead, and Teresa set her phone down. Her chest knotted in a cacophony of emotions: sorrow, hope, frustration, and even fear, that she realized she could hardly feel anything any more but come home he did. And this became their new pattern, the new vicious cycle they were stuck in. Every day he would come home, every day looking even more pale and feeling even more cold to the touch, his personality receding even further into the empty shell that he was becoming, a vacancy behind the eyes that had once been so passionate and full of life. Teresa had to tell him to sit, to eat, to bathe himself. He was like an elderly man who was losing use of his faculties, and Teresa evolved into his loving, but confused and somewhat terrified caretaker aunt every morning. Ray S. side of the bed would be empty again, and he would call Teresa from work shortly after noon to tell her that he was coming home. Teresa noticed that each time his voice sounded more like it was being dragged over stones. Beep like his vocal cords are decaying. Beep, she thought. It was not long before his countenance began to catch up with his voice. He began to look more physically withered, his tall frame beginning to bend, his eyes large in their sockets as his face became even more wan, and his cheeks more sunken. Teresa allowed this cycle to continue for months, her love for her husband locking her in a living beep. But she was rapidly reaching the point of collapse herself, her emotional and mental well-being withering right along with Ray's countenance. "I am coming home," he had said to her over the phone, his voice like dusty rocks being rubbed together, barely recognizable to her. "Wait," she had said. "Ray Don T. Don T, come home. Stay there. It's okay. Stay there." "No," he responded, slowly and without emotion. "No. If I stay here, I'll die. I am coming home." Teresa had hung up the phone, wept, and waited once more for her husband to return. She wept because her husband was dead. She wept because he was alive, and yet dying more every day before her very eyes. She wept because she felt bound to him in whatever repeating loop that his death and their love had created, and she wept because they were together again. And yet she felt entirely alone finally. On the day that Teresa took her own life, she made a decision that came to her easily and without fear. In fact, the idea gave her the first comfort she had felt in the year since Ray had died. Perhaps the key to escaping this living beep was to die herself. More precisely, to die beside Ray as they slept together in bed, and in the morning, when he was gone, perhaps she could be gone too. Gone, but together she called me that afternoon to tell me her story, to tell me her plan, and to tell me goodbye. I listened with terrified disbelief as she recounted the details of her miserable life in the months since Ray had died. Her story was one I could not accept as fact. And yet, simultaneously, I knew from the sound of her tired yet determined voice that my daughter was telling me the absolute truth. "Is Ray there now?" I asked her. "Yes," she said tiredly. "You want to talk to him?" Didn't he answer? But then I heard Teresa say distantly, "It's Dad. Talk to him." There was a shuffling sound, followed by raspy breathing. "Ray," I said, and I was surprised to find my own voice was trembling. Didn't he respond? But I could hear as he attempted to. All I heard was the sound of his laborious breath and the vaguely recognizable tones of his voice as he attempted to speak, but his words were garbled. His voice wasted. Teresa took the phone back. "I have to go now, Daddy. Baby, don't do this," I said, crying but trying to hold myself together. "I love you. Your mother loves you. Let us help you. There has to be some other way." Teresa began to cry. "There is no other way, Daddy. This is the only way." "No," I insisted. You still have so much to live for. Let me take you away from there. You can come here. Maybe Ray 1T come to you anymore, if you re not there. I felt myself playing along with her. Even though I wasn't sure, I even fully believed her. Daddy, there is something else, she said, taking a long and exhausted breath. I am pregnant. I started, then stopped. A hard lump rose in my throat. I couldn't breathe. My mind pieced it together. Teresa was pregnant, and Ray had been dead for more than a year. It is Ray S., she said, answering the question I hadn't asked. But it S., she didn't finish the statement. I don't know what it is. I just know I can't Daddy. I just can't. She wept, she said her final goodbyes to me, ignoring my pleading. And then the call was over. I already told you how the police found her. The autopsy revealed that she had died, consuming a large number of sleeping pills, left helpfully behind by her best friend Cheryl. The autopsy also revealed that she had been several months pregnant. I insisted that this detail never be revealed to her mother, estranged and distant though we are. There are some horrors a mother should be spared when it comes to her own child, so this, as I said, is Teresa's story, and the story of her husband Ray. And you may not believe me, but it is an absolutely true story. As fantastical as that might sound, I believe Teresa now. Although 2 weeks ago, when she told me her story for the first time, of course, I had doubted her. I don't doubt her anymore. Not a single detail. Because every day, she calls to tell me all over again. Story 2. There are 5 waves of time travelers. I mean from the future. They come back in 5 discrete groups. From my perspective, they all jumbled together. I don't know if they all use the same technology to get here. But they all mostly have the same goal to beep. Me, the first wave, was probably more experimental and not expected to succeed. They were obvious to spot. They come running, screaming. They wear metallic jumpsuits, are hairless, and wield big military knives. Dad's gotten good at shooting them before they get within 100 feet of us, the second wave. Still, doesn't have any hair, but they wear mismatched thrift store clothes, stuff that has been out of fashion for several years. They were easy to mistake for hipsters, especially if they were wearing hats to cover their bald heads. They don't scream as they come at me. They do walk with a purpose, as Dad says, though. A few of them have gotten close enough that I've seen their rotting teeth. Either something terrible happens to dentists in the future, or time travel does something to your teeth. My dad is a dentist. At least he was before all this beep beep beep. Dad has a bunch of fake driver S licenses. I possess dozens of fraudulently obtained library cards. They re-reel, but they all under different names: Sally Roberts, Megan Jones, Samantha Smith, plain Jane names, as Dad calls them. Easy for people to forget we live on the road. I am too young to drive, so I read or invent games. The back seat is filled with library books. We've stolen across the country. I have 2 of the same book, one S old and the other S brand new. The old one has lots of notes in it. The other had none when I found it. One game I like to play is to copy all the notes from the older copy into the newer one. It has no Minecraft, but it passes the time between time travelers attempting to beep me beep beep beep. The third wave has black as sin hair, as Dad calls it. I don't know if time travel makes their hair that color, or if third wavers are all like genetically related or something. That is one of the questions I have for the time travelers. I keep a book of questions to ask them. Should I ever get the chance to interview the first one, with black hair, didn't he try to beat me? Not right away. I am not sure for how long, but he followed us. He did stay at the same hotels we did, ate at the same restaurants. He wore normal clothes and did normal things like play games on an iPhone. We were traveling down I-80 at the time, going west. Figured he was making the same trek we found out his true intention when we were halfway through Iowa. He was waiting for us at a gas station in a nowhere town. He carried 2 Ruger Super Redhawks, some huge .454 casual handguns. He tried to dual wield them like a character out of a John Woo movie. One of his bullets hit our car. The other went stray. He was knocked back by the recoil. It gave Dad enough time to get his rifle, aim, and hit him once in the forehead. We drove off, stole another vehicle, and were out of state before sundown. Beep, 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 one day in 7th grade history. Mr. Norris asked the class a hypothetical question. He liked doing this to break up the monotony, as he called it. He asked us, if you could go back in time and beep baby beep, would you? Like the time he asked us if we'd purposefully beep one person to save 5 people tied to railroad tracks. The class was fiercely divided. About half said they'd go back and beep baby beep. The other half said it wrong to beep an infant who hasn't done anything yet. Both sides made sense to me. Now, when I think of that question, I cry. Not for myself so much. I mean, I guess I do, but more so because I miss sitting in Mr. Norris class arguing stuff like that, and I miss the monotony beep beep beep. The 4th wave are the most dangerous. Dad calls them sleepers. They land in the past, sometimes years before I've even been born. and they live normal lives. They know someday they might encounter me. Should that day ever come, they re-prepared to do what's necessary. We were in a diner once, and one of the prep cook-s walked out from the kitchen. He lunged at me with a butcher knife. Dad's left hand was severed fighting him. Early on, Dad's longtime receptionist at his dental clinic grabbed one of his drills and attempted to put it through my skull. She waited for years before she took her chance. Dad didn't beep her right away, so I asked her some of the questions I'd written down. She cried as I read them to her. She said my book of questions is used in interrogations in the future while people are tortured. I told her, well, maybe if you answered my questions, you won't be tortured. Dad thinks she had a cyanide capsule tooth because she died after I said that beep, beep, beep. I dream of building a device, one that let me send explosives into the future, take the fight to them. Once, several months back, we were lying low in the woods near a junkyard. From my library books, I was able to put together disparate pieces of information about how to build a machine. I mostly knew how to build it from the notes in the book. I have I made a prototype of my machine. It was the size of a microwave. Looked a lot like one too. I took a bullet, a .38 special, and put it inside. I set the machine for 10 years from now. It disappeared. I destroyed the prototype and scattered the parts across the junkyard. Beep, beep, beep. The fifth wave was a single person. She was old woman, and I didn't recognize her at first. My face had changed so much, but she still had my eyes. I met her only once years ago. She didn't try to beep me. It was a summer day, and I was home alone while Dad was at work. This was before his receptionist tried to beep me, before any of the other waves. The old woman came into the house through the patio door without asking. She said she was going to make herself lemonade because they stopped selling her favorite brand decades ago. But we had some in our kitchen. She poured us both glasses and asked if we could sit outside near the garden. That was always my favorite spot to read out there. On that sunny day, she told me about a bullet she found in a junkyard 10 years after she sent it into the future, about how she built a bigger and greater machine after her father was murdered by a person with hair black as sin before she left. She gave me an old library book filled with notes. It looked boring at the time, but she told me I'd find it useful someday. She left before Dad got home. I told him everything that she said, and he thought I was joking, but then, over a few weeks, first and second waivers attacked us, and then his receptionist right now. I am trying to enjoy what time I have left with my dad, before someone with hair black as sin kills him, before I find the bullet I sent into the future, before I build my machine. Story 3. The cold didn't he creep into the old Miller house on Sycamore Street. It lived there, even in the height of August, when the sun hammered the peeling white clapboards, and the air outside shimmered with heat. The interior held a damp, subterranean chill that settled into the bones. Illy had inherited the place 6 months ago, after great-aunt Agatha S. Sudden. Quiet passing, he saw it as a fresh start. A chance to escape the city S' relentless noise and expense. A place to write, he told himself, ignoring the unease that prickled his skin the first time he turned the heavy, tarnished key in the lock for the first few weeks. It was manageable. The chill was just an old house settling. The groans and creaks merely protesting timbers. The oppressive silence, solitude. Illy embraced it, setting up his laptop in the sunniest corner of the dusty living room, battling the perpetual gloom with a bright desk lamp. He wrote about mundane things, local history, freelance articles, anything to fill the echoing quiet. Then came the shifts. It started small. A book Illy knew he left on the coffee table would be found upright on the mantelpiece the next morning. A cup of coffee, abandoned for 5 minutes, would return to his desk stone cold. As if hours had passed, he'd chalk it up to forgetfulness, the quirks of an unfamiliar space, but the feeling intensified a prickling sensation at the nape of his neck, the distinct, unsettling certainty of being watched. Even when he was utterly alone, it wasn't a gaze. It was a presence, a slow, heavy regard that seemed to seep from the very walls he named it, privately, in the dark watches of the night, when the silence became a physical weight. Sothoth, a nonsense word dredged from some half-remembered nightmare. Yet it felt fitting for the shapeless dread that inhabited the house, ancient, unknowable. Hungry the manifestations deepened. The chill became localized. Standing in the kitchen, Illy would feel a pocket of icy air wrap around his ankles, thick and viscous, like wading through spectral sludge. His breath would plume visibly, though the thermostat read a steady 68 degrees. One evening, while washing dishes, he glanced at the window above the sink. Reflected in the dark glass, just behind his shoulder, stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its outline shimmering like heat haze off asphalt. He spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing, just the empty hallway, swallowed by shadows. He began documenting the occurrences in a battered notebook. A desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos. Og 12, cold spot in study doorway lasted approx. 3 mins. Felt watched from inside the wall. Og 17. Kitchen window reflection. Tall figure, approx 7 feet. No details. Gone when turned. The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting jagged. Og 22. Woke at 3:17 am. Sound of dripping water in master bedroom. No source. Loud. Insistent. Lasted 10 mins. Felt like counting. The dripping became a nightly torment. Ellie would lie rigid in bed. Sheets pulled to his chin. Listening to the rhythmic plink, plink, plink materialize from the ceiling above him. He'd scramble up. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the plaster. Dry. Always dry. The sound would cease the moment the light hit the spot, leaving only a profound, echoing silence that felt like mockery. He stopped sleeping. The air itself began to change. A smell, faint at first, like damp earth and ozone after a lightning strike, began to permeate the house. It clung to curtains, seeped into upholstery, lingered on Eli's skin, no matter how often he showered. It was the smell of deep places, of things undisturbed for millennia, and with the smell came the whispers. Not voices, not exactly, more like the susurration of dry leaves skittering across stone, or the distant, distorted echo of words spoken underwater. They coiled at the edge of hearing, vanishing the moment he strained to listen, leaving only a residue of profound unease he tried to leave. Packed a bag one rain-lashed Tuesday, determined to drive to a motel. Anywhere but here. He made it as far as the front door. His hand touched the cold brass knob. A wave of pure, paralyzing terror slammed into him. A physical force that rooted him to the spot. It wasn't fear of something outside. It was the absolute, bone-deep certainty that leaving was impossible, that the house and the thing within it, Sothoth, owned him. The bag slipped from his nerveless fingers. He retreated into the oppressive embrace of the hallway. The front door looming behind him, like the sealed lid of a tomb that night. The whispers coalesced. Illy sat huddled in the living room. The desk lamp, casting a small, defiant pool of light against the pressing dark. The smell of wet earth and ozone was thick, cloying. The whispers swirled around him, no longer distant, but intimate, chillingly close. He couldn't decipher words, but he understood the intent. It was curious, observing, and it was here, not just in the house, but in the room, occupying the space just beyond the lamplight. Reach his gaze, drawn by a subtle movement in the gloom near the bookshelf. Caught sight of the wallpaper. The faded floral pattern seemed to ripple, not like paper disturbed by a draft, the surface tension of water, broken by something rising from beneath. Shapes pushed against the paper, from behind elongated, impossibly thin silhouettes that stretched and warped the pattern. They moved with a slow, sinuous grace, tracing unseen paths across the wall. Elias's breath hitched. He watched, frozen, as one of the shapes paused directly opposite him. The wallpaper bulged slightly. A single, impossibly long finger, gray and desiccated like ancient bone, pressed against the paper from the other side, its tip leaving no mark, but radiating a palpable sense of cold. He screamed then. A raw, ragged sound that tore through the silence. The finger withdrew instantly. The bulging shapes vanished. The whispers ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was deeper, heavier, charged with a terrible awareness. He hadn't driven it away. He had merely interrupted its observation days, bled into a blur of exhaustion and escalating dread. The manifestations became bolder. Objects vanished entirely. His favorite pen, a framed photograph of his parents, food in the refrigerator spoiled within hours, covered in a gray, fuzzy mold that smelled like the grave. The cold spots intensified, becoming zones of such profound frigidity they burned his skin. He found strange, greasy smears on the inside of windows high up. Far beyond his reach, the worst was the sense of infiltration. He started feeling things, a phantom pressure on his shoulder when he sat reading, the brush of something cold and dry against the back of his hand. Once, lying in the bath, he felt invisible fingers trail through the water near his submerged leg. He scrambled out, slipping and crashing onto the cold tiles. Retching with terror, he researched frantically, digging into local archives, dusty town records. He found fragmented mentions of the land tales, whispered by the displaced indigenous people, about a sleeping hunger beneath the hills. Records from the early settlers spoke of disappearances, madness, and a strange, pervasive miasma associated with the property. Agatha's own diaries, discovered shoved behind a loose floorboard in the attic, were the most chilling. Pages filled with increasingly erratic script. It watches from the walls, the cold is its breath. It tastes time. It knows my name. It wants to know yours, the final entry. Dated the day before she was found peacefully dead in her bed. Simply read. The teeth are very white. They are always smiling. Ellie felt sanity fraying. Sleep was impossible. He moved his mattress into the living room, huddling perpetually within the circle of lamplight. His back pressed against the wall as if it could offer protection. He knew it couldn't. He knew the walls were where it lived. He could feel it now. A constant, low thrumming vibration in the floorboards, a pressure in the air that made his ears pop. Sothoth wasnn't he just in the house. It was the house, the foundation stones, the joists. The plaster all were saturated with its ancient, alien presence. It was the cold, the smell, the whispers, the dripping. It was the shifting air, the misplaced objects. It was the thing that pressed against the wallpaper escape, was a ludicrous fantasy. The house wouldn't he let him go. The world outside the grimy windows seemed distant, unreal, like a faded painting. The only reality was the encroaching dark. And the thing that waited within it one rain-slicked night. The power failed. Not a flicker, but a total, absolute plunge into darkness, so complete it felt solid. The silence roared. Eli fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking violently. He clicked the switch. Nothing. The batteries, fresh that morning, were dead. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He was blind. He crouched on the mattress, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to make himself small. The smell of wet earth and ozone intensified, filling his nostrils, coating his tongue. The cold descended, not as a spot, but as an enveloping shroud, pressing in from all sides. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. Then another sound. Close. Very close. Scritch, 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 like long fingernails, slowly, deliberately, dragging across the wooden floorboards just beyond the edge of the mattress. Moving towards him, he whimpered, pressing himself harder against the wall. The sound stopped. Silence, thicker and more menacing than before. He could feel it, standing over him, leaning down. The cold radiating from it was unbearable. A physical force pushing the air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move then. Warmth. A sudden, shocking warmth against his ear. Not the warmth of life, but the fetid, moist heat of decay. Like breath expelled from a long-sealed tomb, it carried the faintest echo of those underwater whispers, forming a single, intelligible word that vibrated directly into his skull, bypassing his ears. It knew his name, truly knew it, not just the sound, but the essence of him. The sound wasn't spoken, it was imprinted. Paralysis held him. Terror was a cold stone in his gut. He felt something impossibly dry and sharp, like splintered bone, graze his cheek. A featherlight touch, yet it burned with a cold fire. Then a pressure against his lips, not forceful, but insistent, probing, tasting the fear sweat on his skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears freezing on his lashes as suddenly as it had come. The presence withdrew. The crushing cold lessened fractionally. The suffocating pressure lifted just enough for him to gasp a ragged, shuddering breath. He dared not open his eyes. He lay there, trembling violently, for what felt like hours, listening to the pounding of his own heart, and the oppressive silence of the house dawn finally seeped through the grimy windows. A gray, cheerless light that did nothing to dispel the dread. Exhausted, broken, Illy forced himself to move. He needed water. He shuffled towards the kitchen, his limbs leaden. The floorboards creaked underfoot. The sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He reached the kitchen doorway and froze. The linoleum floor near the sink was wet, not from a leak. It was a distinct pattern. Footprints, bare feet, long and unnaturally narrow, with toes that tapered into sharp points. They led from the back door, which was still securely locked and bolted across the floor, stopping directly in front of the sink, where he had stood just yesterday, washing dishes. Seeing the reflection, his eyes followed the prints. They didn't lead away. They simply stopped, as if whoever, or whatever had made them, had vanished into thin air. Right there a choked sound escaped Illy's throat. He backed away slowly, his gaze fixed on the prints. His retreating foot bumped something soft. He looked down. It was his missing framed photograph of his parents. It lay face down on the floor. Slowly, with trembling hands, he picked it up. The glass was shattered. Jagged cracks radiated outwards from the center. But it wasn't the broken glass that stopped his heart. It was the photograph itself. His parents' faces were untouched, smiling, frozen in a moment of happiness years gone, but covering the lower half of the picture, obscuring their bodies, was a thick, wet smear of something dark and viscous. It looked like old, congealed blood mixed with mud, and pressed into this foul substance, perfectly preserved in the muck, were dozens, no, hundreds of tiny, sharp imprints. Teeth, marks not animal, humanoid perhaps, but wrong. Too many, too sharp, arranged in rows that suggested a maw far larger and more complex than anything nature could devise. The imprints formed a chaotic, overlapping pattern, a horrifying signature left in the filthily dropped the picture, as if it had burned him. It clattered on the floorboards, the sound obscenely loud. He stumbled back into the living room, collapsing onto the mattress. The cold was already returning, seeping up from the floor, coiling around his ankles. The smell of wet earth and ozone filled his nostrils. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. He knew then, with absolute, soul-crushing certainty, what Agatha had meant. Sothoth wasn't just watching, it was tasting, sampling his fear, his isolation, his very existence. It wasn't done. The footprints stopping, the photograph defiled. It wasn't a message. It was a display, a predator showing its prey. The futility of resistance, he wrapped his arms around himself, rocking slightly, staring into the gray gloom of the living room. The lamplight was useless against the deeper shadows gathering in the corners, thickening like clotting blood. He could feel the vibration in the floor again, that low, insistent thrumming that resonated in his bones. It wasn't the house settling. It was a pulse, and then, in the darkest corner of the room, furthest from the weak dawn light filtering through the window, the shadows seemed to coalesce, not into a shape exactly, but into a density, a patch of purest black that drank the light around it. It shimmered subtly, like heat haze over a desert road, but cold, so cold the air crackled with frost inches away from Italy. Couldn't look away. Terror locked his gaze. Within that impossible darkness, 2 points of light ignited, not eyes, pinpricks of absolute void, colder than the space between stars. They fixed on him. A sound began, emanating from the density, not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly within his skull cavity. It was the sound of stone grinding against stone deep underground, the groan of tectonic plates shifting under impossible pressure. It was ancient, incomprehensible, and filled with a terrible, alien intelligence. The vibration intensified, becoming a physical pressure against his mind. Images, jagged and nonsensical, flickered behind his eyes. Vast, cyclopean architecture under a black sun. Chasms plunging into lightless depths where things with too many limbs writhed. A sky filled not with stars, but with watching, lidless eyes. It was a glimpse into the entity's reality, a reality that defied geometry and sanity, a glimpse that threatened to unmake him. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The sound, the images, were inside him. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. No, he whimpered, the word a pathetic puff of vapor in the frigid air. Please. No, the vibration ceased abruptly. The images vanished. The silence that followed was deafening, charged with a terrible expectancy. Illy dared to open his eyes. The dense patch of shadow was still there. The void points still watched him. But now, something else was happening. The darkness within the shadow seemed to be parting, not like a curtain, but like thick, viscous liquid slowly separating. And within that parting darkness, something began to emerge, not a limb, not a face, teeth row upon row of them, impossibly white against the consuming blackness. They weren't anchored in gums or jawbone. They seemed to float, suspended in the darkness, shifting and rotating slowly. They varied in size and shape, some needle-sharp, others flat and grinding, others curved like sickles, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, arranged in a spiraling, chaotic pattern that hurt the eyes to look upon. They glistened faintly, as if what they were the teeth Agatha had written about. The teeth that were always smiling. The sight wasn't just horrifying. It was profoundly wrong. It violated every instinct, every understanding of form and biology. This wasn't a mouth. It was an aperture, a gateway into something unspeakable. The teeth shifted again, clicking softly against each other. A sound like pebbles tumbling down a deep well. The void points above them seemed to sharpen their focus onily. He felt a fresh wave of that probing, tasting attention. It wasn't aggression, not yet. It was assessment, curiosity, the slow, deliberate inspection of something trapped and utterly vulnerable. A low hum emanated from the mass of teeth, a sound that vibrated in Ellie's molars. It wasn't directed at him. It seemed to resonate through the house itself, making the floorboards tremble, the walls sigh. He realized, with a fresh surge of icy dread, that it was a call, a summoning. The entity wasn't alone within the house's structure. It was calling the other presences he'd sensed in the walls. The shifting shapes behind the wallpaper shadows began to deepen in other corners of the room. Patches of unnatural darkness coalesced, shimmering with the same impossible cold. More void points ignited, watching him. More sections of darkness began to stir, hinting at further, hidden horrors waiting to be revealed. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, saturated with the smell of ancient stone and ozone. And something else, a dry, sweet scent like long-buried bonelli, huddled on the mattress, trapped in the center of the living room, surrounded by awakening darkness. The teeth in the first shadow mass parted wider, revealing not a throat, but a deeper, swirling blackness that seemed to pull at the very light. The hum intensified, becoming a chorus of alien vibrations that resonated in his bones, in his teeth, in the hollow spaces of his skull. He understood now, with a clarity that was worse than madness. Sothoth wasn't just an entity in the house. It was the house, and the land beneath it, and the deep, forgotten places below. It was ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to him, except as a momentary curiosity, a fleeting taste upon its countless teeth. Escape wasn't impossible. It was a concept that no longer held meaning in this violated geometry. The cold deepened. The teeth glistened. The void points watched, unblinking. The humming chorus swelled, filling the room, filling Ellie's world. The light from the window seemed to dim further. As if the dawn itself was retreating from the gathering dark, he closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in utter, desolate surrender. There was only the cold, the teeth, and the slow, inevitable closing of the dark. The smile was everywhere now, and it was very, very hungry. Story 4. The salt air used to smell clean to Arlo. Now it tasted like decay. It clung to his skin, seeped into his worn flannel shirt, and carried the low, mournful groan of the sea against the jagged rocks, far below his lighthouse perch. That's what it felt like now. Not a home, not a duty, but a precarious vantage point over an encroaching, incomprehensible darkness. He'd taken the job at the Sentinel Light for the solitude, after the city's crushing noise, and the hollow ache of losing Clara. The isolated granite tower perched on the storm-battered cliffs of Cape Viridian seemed like sanctuary. Just him, the rhythm of the waves, and the ancient, reassuring sweep of the beacon cutting through the night fog. For 6 months, it was exactly that. Peaceful, healing. Then the whispers started, not voices, not exactly, more like the static between radio stations, but colder, wetter, seeming to emanate from the damp stone walls themselves, especially near the spiral staircase that corkscrewed down into the lighthouse bowels. Arlo blamed it on fatigue, on the wind finding new fissures in the old mortar. He tightened bolts, checked wiring, and tried to ignore the faint, metallic taste that lingered on his tongue afterward. Like licking a frozen battery, the first undeniable manifestation happened on a night thick with fog. Arlo was in the watchroom, meticulously polishing the massive Fresnel lens, the heart of the beacon. The rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of the rotating mechanism was a familiar comfort. Then it stuttered, not a mechanical failure. The motor hummed steadily, but the light itself seemed to hesitate. For a fraction of a second, the brilliant white beam flickered, and in that impossible darkness, Arlo saw something else reflected in the glass he was cleaning. Not his own weary face, but a depth, a swirling, impossible blackness that seemed to contain distant, cold points of light, not stars, but something hungry, watching. It vanished as the light surged back, leaving him trembling, the rag clutched in a white-knuckled fist. The image of that abyssal reflection seared into his mind. He reported a minor electrical glitch to the mainland. They promised a technician in a fortnight. Arlo began sleeping less. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, chilling sensation. A wordless, ancient attention. He felt it most strongly near the tide pools, exposed at the base of the cliffs, during low tide, ancient rocks, smoothed by millennia of ocean, held brackish water that seemed unnaturally still, unnaturally dark. One afternoon, checking the foundations, he saw it. The tide, wasn't receding. It was waiting. The water in the pools, didn't ripple. It held a perfect, mirror-like stillness. He peered into one, seeing only the reflection of the brooding sky. Then his own reflection blinked, slowly, deliberately, while he hadn't scrambled back up the treacherous path, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing the world beyond the lantern room windows. The beam cut through it, a feeble sword against an endless, suffocating shroud. The whispers weren't static anymore. They were sibilant, wet syllables that slithered just below the threshold of understanding, emanating from the fog itself. Here, see, no. The air grew heavy, cold, and thick with the smell of ozone and brine, undercut by a deeper, more primal scent like wet stone from a cave untouched by sunlight. For eons Zarlo tried the radio. Static. The satellite phone. Dead air. The landline. A hollow, echoing silence that seemed to stretch infinitely. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in his gut. He wasn't alone. He never had been. Something vast, something older than the cliffs themselves, was here, and it was aware of him. He retreated to the living quarters, a small room halfway down the tower. He barricaded the door with a heavy sea chest, lit every lamp, and huddled on his narrow bunk, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand. The silence outside the door was worse than the whispers. It was a listening silence. He felt its weight, its focus, pressing against the thin wood. Hours bled into each other. Exhaustion warred with terror. He must have dozed. He woke to utter darkness. The power was out. Not just the lamps, the relentless thrum of the generator, the faint glow of standby lights, the digital clock, all gone. Only the oppressive, suffocating blackness remained, and the cold. It was a deep, marrow-chilling cold that seemed to leach the heat directly from his body. He fumbled for the emergency lantern beside his bunk. Its beam cut a shaky circle in the dark, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. He swung it towards the door. The sea chest was undisturbed. Relief was short-lived. His shadow, cast by the lantern light onto the opposite wall, wasn't his own. It was taller, thinner, its limbs grotesquely elongated, and it wasn't mimicking his movements. As he watched, frozen in horror, the shadow slowly turned its head towards him. Where its face should have been was a swirling vortex of deeper darkness. It raised one impossibly long, spindly arm, pointing a finger that ended in a sharp, shadowy talon directly at him. A soundless scream tore at Arlo's throat. Trapped there by sheer terror, he scrambled backwards, the lantern beam jerking wildly. His shadow snapped back to normal as the light shifted, but he knew it was still there, waiting in the periphery. The presence wasn't just outside. It was inside the tower, inside the walls, inside the silence. It was the silence. He felt its intelligence, ancient and utterly alien. A consciousness that operated on scales he couldn't fathom. Motives beyond good or evil, existing only to perceive, to consume perception. The whispers had been its first tentative touch. The reflections, its exploration. The shadow that was its focused attention, driven by primal terror. Arlo bolted. He shoved the sea chest aside, wrenched open the door, and plunged into the pitch-black stairwell. He had to get out, down to the base, out onto the rocks. Anything but this suffocating tomb. He stumbled down the spiral stairs. The beam of his lantern, a frantic, bobbing eye in the consuming dark. The cold intensified with every step downward. His breath plumed white in the lantern light, freezing instantly on his beard. The whispers returned, not in his ears, but vibrating in his bones, in the granite itself. Mine, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a fact. He reached the heavy iron door, leading to the outside. Frigid sea air blasted him as he shoved it open. The fog was still there, impenetrable, but the biting wind felt almost cleansing after the tower's tomb-like chill. He staggered out onto the slick rocks, the lantern beam swallowed by the fog mere feet ahead. He had to get to the supply shed, maybe find the old dinghy, though the thought of launching into that black, whispering water filled him with fresh dread. He took a few shaky steps. Then he heard it, a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a slow, rhythmic dragging from the direction of the tide pools, heavy, deliberate, like something immense pulling itself across stone. It came from multiple points around him, hidden by the fog. He swung the lantern, but the beam revealed only swirling gray emptiness and wet, glistening rock. The dragging sound stopped. Silence descended again, thicker than the fog, colder than the wind. Arlo stood paralyzed. The dragging started again, closer this time, much closer, to his left. He whipped the lantern beam around. Nothing. Then, directly behind him, he spun, heart-lurching. Still nothing but fog and rock. The sound circled him, unseen. A predator testing the boundaries of its prey. He backed up, towards the relative safety of the lighthouse door. His heel slipped on a patch of slick kelp. He fell hard, the lantern flying from his hand. It hit the rocks, with a sickening crunch of glass and plastic. The light died, instantly darkness, absolute and crushing, slammed down. The dragging sound ceased. The whispering stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Arlo lay on the cold stone, utterly blind, utterly exposed. He could feel it now, not just around him, but beneath him, in the rock, in the sea, in the air, an ancient, insatiable hunger that had slumbered for epochs beneath Cape Veridian, awakened by his isolation, his loneliness, his very presence. It wasn't just hunting him, it was tasting him, learning him then, a new sound, a wet, clicking sigh, like massive stone jaws shifting, coming from directly above him in the fog. A wave of that impossible cold washed over him, carrying the stench of deep ocean trenches and forgotten eons. He felt a pressure, not physical, but psychic, an immense, alien consciousness focusing its full, dreadful attention upon the insignificant spark of awareness that was Arlo. It wasn't anger. It wasn't malice. It was the chilling, indifferent scrutiny of something vast observing an insect, and it found him. Interesting, he squeezed his eyes shut, curling into a ball on the unforgiving rock, tears freezing on his cheeks. Escape wasn't impossible. It was laughable. The lighthouse door was only yards away, but it might as well have been on the moon. The entity wasn't confined to the tower. The tower, the cliffs, the sea, they were all part of it. He was adrift on the surface of a fathomless, sentient abyss that had only just noticed him skittering across its skin-a single. Resonant note vibrated through the air, through the stone, through his very bones. It was a sound older than language, devoid of melody. Heavy with a meaning he instinctively understood. Mine. Above him, high on the cliff face, the sentinel light S beacon suddenly flared back to life. Its powerful beam cut through the fog like a blade, sweeping across the cove. It swept over Arlo, huddled and broken on the rocks, and in that brilliant, momentary illumination, he saw them, not creatures, not forms he could comprehend, but distortions, where the beam touched the fog near the tide pools. The light bent and warped, outlining impossible angles, vast, segmented shapes that defied perspective, and countless, faceless eyes that reflected the light with a cold, alien luminescence. They were watching. They had always been watching then. The beam swept on, plunging him back into the fog, and the crushing, attentive dark. The dragging sounds resumed, slow, deliberate, closing in from all sides. The whispers returned, not as noise, but as a direct, icy intrusion into his mind, carrying images of crushing depths, of lightless gulfs, of an eternity of being known by that which defied understanding. The hollow star had found its new keeper, not to tend the light, but to witness the dark, and Arlo knew, with a soul-deep certainty that shattered the last remnants of his sanity, that the true horror wasn't death. It was the unending awareness, the dreadful, inescapable realization that he was now forever seen, forever known, forever held in the cold, eternal gaze of the thing beneath Cape Viridian. The light above swept again, a cruel, cyclical reminder of the world he could no longer reach. Below him, the dragging sounds reached the edge of the rock where he lay. The cold deepened, the silence waited, and the ancient, unknowable presence, satisfied, began to feed. Story 5. The silence of the Hemlock Ridge cabin wasn't peaceful. It was thick, suffocating, like wool packed into your ears. Elias Thorne had come seeking solace after the implosion of his life, the failed marriage. The career stalled in stagnant water. The gnawing suspicion that he was fundamentally wrong. Solitude, he de-reasoned, would offer clarity. Instead, the deep winter woods offered only an amplified echo of his own anxieties. A vast, white emptiness that seemed to press inwards. The first night passed uneventfully. Just the groan of ancient timbers settling, and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. But on the second night, the silence fractured. Elias woke abruptly, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It wasn't a sound that woke him, but the absence of one, the constant, subliminal hum of the refrigerator had vanished. The cabin was plunged into a profound, unnatural quiet. Only the frantic thudding of his own pulse filled the void. He fumbled for the heavy-duty flashlight beside the bed. Its beam cut a trembling swat through the absolute darkness, illuminating swirling motes of dust, frozen in the icy air. The cold was different now, deeper. It seeped through the thick woolen socks he wore, prickling his skin with an almost electric charge. It smelled faintly of ozone, and something else, something metallic and wet. Like old pennies buried in damp earth, he shuffled towards the kitchen, the beam of light jerking erratically. The silence pressed down, a physical weight. He reached the fridge, dead. He flicked the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. He checked the propane generator before bed. It had been fine. A surge of irrational fear tightened his throat. He forced himself to the cabin's single, large window, overlooking the snow-blanketed clearing outside. The world was a study in monochrome, under the weak moonlight, filtering through heavy clouds. The snow glowed with an eerie, internal luminescence. and then he saw it. Movement. Not an animal, but a distortion. A patch of darkness near the tree line seemed to ripple, like heat haze off asphalt, but cold. It pulsed, subtly, breathing in the stillness. As he stared, frozen, a single, perfect snowflake drifted down and passed through the rippling patch, vanishing without a trace. Elias blinked hard. Nothing, just undisturbed snow, and the skeletal arms of winter Treesy backed away from the window. His breath pluming white in the flashlight S-beam. Just tired, just stressed. The mind plays tricks in the dark. He repeated the mantra, but the metallic smell seemed stronger now. Clinging to the back of his tongue, he decided to check the generator shed. A small, rickety structure 20 yards from the cabin. Bundling up, he pushed open the heavy front door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The silence outside was even more profound. The snow absorbing every sound he crunched through the knee-deep snow. The beam of his flashlight carving a tunnel in the oppressive dark. The generator shed door was slightly ajar. He distinctly remembered latching it. His hand trembled as he pushed it open wider. The beam swept over the silent generator. The fuel line had been cleanly severed, not chewed, not ripped cut, neatly, and beside it, pressed into the frost on the metal casing, was a perfect, child-sized handprint. Not frost, melted ice, as if something impossibly cold had touched it. Elias stumbled back, panic flaring. He scrambled towards the cabin, his boots slipping in the snow. He slammed the door shut, bolted it, and leaned against it, gasping. The metallic smell was overpowering now, filling the small living space. He scanned the room with the flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place. Then the beam caught the old, battery-powered radio on the shelf. He brought it for emergencies. He switched it on, desperate for any sound. Any connection to the outside world static hissed, a comforting white noise. He fiddled with the dial, searching for a station. More static. Then, faintly, a voice. Distorted, fragmented, but recognizable as a local news broadcast. Relief washed over him. He turned up the volume. Repeat blizzard warning Hemlock Ridge area. Avoid travel power outages. Reported. The relief was short-lived. The voice began to stutter, repeating fragments. Blizz. Ridge. Avoid. Travel outages. Then it dissolved entirely into a guttural, wet sound, like someone drowning in mud. Elias recoiled. The sound shifted, becoming a low, rhythmic clicking, like chitinous claws tapping on glass. It grew louder, filling the small cabin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once suddenly. The static roared, then cut out completely. silence slammed back down, heavier than before. Then, from the Radio S speaker, a new sound emerged, a voice impossibly close, whispering directly into the speaker, yet echoing as if from a vast distance. It wasn't human. It was a dry, papery rasp, layered with that same wet clicking. Elias, it breathed. We know your silence. We taste your fear. It S. Delicious Elias hurled the radio across the room. It hit the wall with a plastic crack and fell silent. He stood panting, sweat chilling on his brow, despite the deepening cold. Hallucination. Stress-induced psychosis. The rationalizations felt flimsy, pathetic shields against the visceral terror. Coiling in his gut, he needed light. More light. He gathered every candle he could find, thick stubs of beeswax, and lit them, placing them around the main room. The flickering light created monstrous, dancing shadows on the log walls. But it was better than the oppressive dark. He sat huddled on the worn sofa, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the weak flames. The silence returned, but now it felt watchful. Expectant he must have dozed off. But the rippling patch was back, larger now, and closer, much closer. It hovered just beyond the porch, a shifting void that seemed to drink the weak moonlight. As he watched, transfixed, shapes began to coalesce within the distortion, not solid forms, but suggestions. Elongated limbs too thin for bones, a multiplicity of eyes that reflected no light, only depth, and a gaping maw that seemed to open onto absolute nothingness. They weren't quite there, flickering in and out of perception, like a half-remembered nightmare. The whispering started again. Not from the radio this time. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the floorboards, from the icy air itself. It was layered, the dry rasp, the wet clicking, and now, beneath it, a chorus of faint, despairing sobs that echoed his own terror. You called to the silence. Elias, the dry voice hissed. You fed it with your emptiness. We are the echoes you feared, the clicking voice added. The sound seeming to vibrate in his jawbone, where the new teeth throbbed. You are becoming. Hospitable, the chorus of sobs wailed, sending chills down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Elias pressed his hands against his ears. But the voices weren't outside. They were inside, in his head, resonating with the cold ache in his jaw, with the unnatural points scraping against his tongue. He looked down at his hands. Were his fingers longer, thinner? The knuckles seemed more pronounced. He felt a strange, brittle coldness spreading up his forearms. He lurched towards the door, driven by a primal urge to flee, to escape the cabin, the whispering, the thing outside, the horror growing within his own mouth. He fumbled with the bolt, his hands clumsy, fingers feeling numb and distant. He yanked the door open. The cold hit him. But it wasn't just the winter air. It was the cold of the void. The cold radiating from the rippling distortion that now filled the entire porch. It stood directly before him. A wall of seething, impossible darkness. The suggested shapes within it solidified for a fraction of a second. A forest of spindly limbs. A galaxy of cold, dead stars for eyes. And that yawning maw, now close enough for him to feel its pull. A suction not of air, but of warmth, of sound, of self. He tried to scream again, but his throat constricted. All that came out was a wet, clicking gurgle, horribly similar to the sound from the radio. The new teeth in his mouth vibrated in sympathy. The distortion didn't attack. It simply enveloped. It flowed over him like freezing oil, soaking through his clothes, his skin, his bones. The cold was absolute, burning and numbing simultaneously. The whispers crescendoed, becoming a single, deafening shriek inside his skull. A sound of ultimate negation. He felt his thoughts scattering, his memories dissolving like sugar in water. The fear remained, a raw animal terror. But even that began to fray at the edges. Consumed by the encroaching void, he didn't feel himself fall. One moment, he was standing on the threshold. The next, he was on his knees in the snow. The distortion clinging to him like a second skin, leaching the heat from his core. He looked up at the cabin window. The candlelight within flickered weakly, casting his shadow on the snow. But it wasn't his shadow. It was elongated, grotesquely thin, its head misshapen, its jaw distended into a nightmare. Maw-filled with jagged point, the revelation struck him with the force of physical pain. This wasn't an invasion. It was a reflection. The silence he feared. The emptiness he carried inside. The fundamental wrongness he sensed in himself. It hadn't attracted these things. It was these things. Or rather, it was the fertile ground from which they grew. They weren't separate entities. They were manifestations of the void within him, given form and hunger by the deep, ancient silence of the woods. He hadn't found the cabin. The cabin and the silence it guarded had found him. It recognized its own. The cold seeped deeper, reaching his heart. The struggle ceased. The terror didn't vanish. It simply became part of the encompassing cold. A fossilized emotion trapped in ice. He felt the new teeth in his mouth lengthen slightly, pressing against his lips from the inside. A profound stillness settled over him, deeper than the winter silence. It was the stillness of absolute zero, the stillness of the vacuum between stars. The rippling distortion slowly withdrew from his body, leaving him kneeling in the snow. It hovered for a moment, a shapeless blot against the night, then flowed soundlessly back towards the tree line, dissolving into the shadows. Elias Thorne remained on his knees. The wind picked up, swirling snow around him, but he didn't feel it. He didn't feel anything. Not the cold, not the blood drying on his chin, not the alien hardness filling his mouth. Inside, where his thoughts had been, there was only a vast, echoing silence, a perfect, consuming quiet. He slowly rose. His movements were stiff, puppet-like. He turned and shuffled back towards the open cabin door. He needed to be inside the quiet, inside the dark. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the weak moonlight. The candles had burned down to stubs, their blue flames guttering out one by one. In the returning darkness, deeper and more absolute than before, Elias sat back down on the sofa. He stared into the blackness where the last flame had died. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic click, click, click coming from his own mouth. A sound like cold bone tapping against cold bone. He ran his tongue over the new, sharp points. They felt right, familiar, like coming home. He sat there in the perfect, unbroken silence, the silence he had craved and now embodied. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the cabin, the clearing, the woods, covering everything in a pristine, soundless shroud. Inside, Elias Thorne, or what remained of him, sat perfectly still, listening to the beautiful, empty quiet, and somewhere deep within the frozen cavern of his chest, a new kind of hunger stirred, vast, patient, cold. It felt like chewing. Story 6. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when a leaner Vance arrived in Cairnhold. It wasn't a town, not really. Just a clutch of damp stone cottages huddled against the relentless grey of the Scottish Highlands, dwarfed by the brooding presence of the ancient pine forest, known locally as the Black Weald. Her destination, however, lay beyond the village, up on the wind-scoured moor. The Cairnhold Stonezaliner was an academic, specializing in obscure folklore. Her thesis focused on localized protective rituals surrounding Neolithic monuments, and Cairnhold stones were legendary in certain dusty tomes. Legends spoke of the Whispering Stones, guardians against something older and darker that slumbered beneath the Black Weald. The villagers, however, offered only wary silence or muttered warnings when she inquired. Mrs. Byan, the stoic owner of the village only inn, the Shepherd Rest, pressed a small, dried sprig of yew into her hand as she handed over the key to her room. For the stones, Miss Vance, she said, her voice low and rough as peat smoke. Brush them with it, clockwise, before dusk, and whatever ye hear dinny answer, not a word. They re-watchin', always watchin'. The crow woman walks when the mist comes down. Eleanor, ever the rationalist, pocketed the U with a polite smile. Superstition, protective charms were common folklore, psychological bulwarks against the unknown. The crow woman sounded like a local boogaman, a personification of the harsh landscape the next morning. Under a sky the color of a bruise, Eleanor hiked towards the moor. The air hung thick and cold, smelling of wet earth and decaying pine needles. The black weald loomed on her left, an impenetrable wall of shadow as she crested the rise. The cairnhold stones appeared they, wherein T grand, like Stonehenge, 7 weathered megaliths, jagged and blackened by centuries, formed a rough circle on the uneven ground. Moss clung to their bases like a sickly green beard. An oppressive silence hung over the place, broken only by the mournful cry of a lone crow circling high above. The air felt denser here, charged with a static unease that raised the fine hairs on Eleanor's arms. She felt Watch drawing the yew sprig from her pocket. She approached the nearest stone. Its surface was deeply pitted, scarred by time and weather, as her fingers brushed the cold, rough surface. A faint vibration seemed to travel up her arm. She dismissed it as the wind, or her imagination. Methodically, she began brushing each stone clockwise with the yew, as instructed. The action felt absurd, yet strangely ritualistic. As she worked, a low sound began to permeate the silence. Not the wind. It was a susurration, a chorus of faint, overlapping whispers emanating from the stones themselves. They seemed to coil around her, unintelligible, yet laden with a desperate urgency. Ignore it, she told herself firmly. Acoustic anomaly. Wind through fissures. She completed the circuit, just as the first tendrils of mist began snaking up from the black weald below. The whispering intensified, becoming sharper, more distinct, though the words remained frustratingly elusive. It sounded like pleading, like warnings hissed from a great distance. The crow overhead cawed, a harsh, discordant sound suddenly. A figure stood at the edge of the stone circle, where none had been a moment before. A woman, impossibly tall and thin, draped in ragged black cloth that seemed to absorb the weak light. Her face was hidden in deep shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But Eleanor felt the weight of her gaze. The crow woman, a tremor of genuine fear, primal and cold, shot through Eleanor's academic detachment. The figure. Didn't he move? Didn't he speak? The whispering stones seemed to swell in volume, a frantic counterpoint to her silent presence. Alina remembered Mrs. By S. warning. Didn't answer. She clamped her mouth shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mist thickened, swirling around the stones, obscuring the figure for a moment. When it cleared, she was gone. Shaken, Alina hurried back to the village. She threw herself into research, poring over photocopies of crumbling parish records and local histories she brought. Buried in a 17th century chronicle, she found it. The covenant of stone and blood, the Cairnhold stones, wherein just guardians, they were wards, prison bars. Beneath the black weald, the text claimed, lay a slumbering entity known only as an TSL Og, the host, not dead, not alive, but a coalescence of ancient malice and forgotten sorrows, drawn to the land deep, dark places. The stones, empowered by ritual and sacrifice, kept it bound. The ritual wasn't merely protective. It was necessary. Daily at dusk, the appointed keeper, always a woman of the village, chosen by descent, must anoint the stones with a drop of her own blood mixed with crushed yew berries. Then walk the circle clockwise, whispering the names of the dead, specifically the names of those claimed by an TSL Og when the wards had weakened in the past. The whispering Alina heard. It was the accumulated pleas of those lost souls, bound to the stones, reinforcing the barrier with their anguish. The crow woman, she wasn't a monster. She was the keeper, or rather, the current manifestation of the eternal guardian spirit bound to the land. A shape-shifting watcher who intervened only when the ritual failed. Failure meant a sacrifice, and TSL Og demanded a life to sate its hunger and return to its slumber the blood, drained from a leaner face. The yew brushing was a simplified version for outsiders, a token gesture. The true ritual required blood and memory, and the last recorded keeper line. It had died out 50 years ago. No one had performed the true ritual since. The stones had been whispering their warnings, unanswered for decades. The crow woman's appearance wasn't a random sighting. It was a sign the wards were critically weak that evening. As the mist rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the village whole, the whispering began, not just from the moor. It seeped from the very stones of the cottages. A soft, insidious chorus carried on the damp air. People huddled inside, faces pale, drawing curtains tight. Mrs. By sat rigid in her chair by the fire, clutching a faded photograph of a young woman. My aunt, she whispered to Alina, her voice cracking. She was the last. She went up to the stones one night when the whispering wouldn't stop. Never came back. They found only her shawl, caught on the U at the edge of the wheel. The night deepened. The whispering grew louder, more agitated. It wasn't just please now. It was hunger. A vast, hollow yearning that vibrated in the bones. Then the screaming started. Not human screams. Something far older, more guttural, echoing from the heart of the black weald. It was the sound of chains straining, of earth tearing. Panic seized Cairnhold. Doors were bolted, prayers muttered, old protective sigils hastily chalked on thresholds. Alina stood frozen at her window, staring into the swirling gray. She saw movement, shapes indistinct and enormous, shifting within the mist near the tree line, darker patches against the gray, hinting at impossible limbs, at glistening obsidian hides. The host was stirring, driven by a desperate blend of academic responsibility and burgeoning terror. Alina knew what she had to do. She couldn't perform the full ritual she wasn't of the bloodline. But maybe, just maybe, the simplified version, with intent, could buy time. She grabbed the yew sprig, and a small penknife from her bag. The moor was a nightmare landscape. The mist clung like cold, wet cobwebs, reducing visibility to mere feet. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of lost voices shrieking in her mind. The stones loomed ahead, darker islands in the gray sea. The air crackled with malevolent energy. She could feel it, a vast, cold presence pushing against the weakening barrier, emanating from the weald. The ground trembled slightly underfoot, hands shaking. Alina reached the first stone. She pricked her finger with the knife, smearing a single drop of blood onto the rough surface beside the carved spiral. She now noticed. She brushed it frantically with the yew sprig. "Please," she whispered, her voice lost in the din. "Hold. Just hold." She moved to the next stone, repeating the action. Blood. You. Plea. The whispering seemed to focus on her, swirling around her head. Fragments of sentences tore at her sanity. Cold, so cold, teeth in the dark. Don't let it take me. She saw fleeting images behind her eyes. Figures being dragged into yawning earth. Skeletal hands clawing at roots. A pair of vast, lidless eyes opening in the deep on the fourth stone. She froze, standing just outside the circle. Wreathed in mist was the crow woman. Her head was tilted, watching. Alina could see no face within the shadow of the hat. Only a deeper darkness. A single, unnaturally large crow perched silently on her shoulder. Alina whimpered, but forced herself to the fifth stone. Blood. You. Her finger stung. The screaming from the weald intensified, joined now by a low, grinding sound, like massive stones being dragged. The ground shook more violently as she smeared blood on the sixth stone. A wave of pure, psychic dread washed over her. It carried the scent of dank earth and rotting meat, the taste of copper and despair. She stumbled, dropping the yew sprig. The whispering became a roar of terror. The crow woman took a single step forward. Alina scrambled for the sprig. Her hands numb with cold and fear. She lunged for the seventh and final stone. Just as her bloodied finger touched the cold rock, a guttural roar, impossibly loud and close, erupted from the black weald. The mist directly in front of the stones ripped apart, not parted, but tore, as if reality itself split for a fraction of a second. Alina saw it, not the host, but the doorway, a jagged fissure in the air, revealing not the forest beyond, but an abyss of swirling, hungry darkness. Within that darkness, countless points of cold, greenish light flickered like malevolent stars' eyes, and something vast, something that defied shape and sanity, pressed against the opening. It wasn't a creature. It was absence. It was hunger given form. It was the maw of an TSL Og. The crow woman threw her head back and let out a shriek that wasn't human, a sound of pure, ancient fury and sorrow. She lunged, not at Alina, but towards the tearing rift, her form seeming to blur and expand. Alina, driven by primal terror, forgot the final instruction. She screamed. A raw, ragged sound of utter horror ripped from her throat. The reaction was instantaneous. The whispering stones fell utterly, terrifyingly silent. The tearing rift snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap. The oppressive pressure vanished, replaced by a vacuum of silence, so profound it hurt Alina's ears. The crow woman froze mid-lunge, then slowly turned her hidden face towards Alina. The mist cleared rapidly, revealing the moor under the indifferent light of a crescent moon. The stones stood silent and cold. The crow woman was gone, but the silence, it was worse than the noise. It was the silence of judgment, past shaking violently. Alina stumbled back towards Cairnhold. The village was silent too, but it was the silence of held breath. She reached the inn, collapsing inside. Mrs. Byron took one look at her face and sank into a chair, her own face ashen. "They're quiet," Alina gasped. "The stones, they stopped." Mrs. Byron closed her eyes, a single tear tracking through the wrinkles on her cheek. She whispered, her voice hollow. "They've taken the offering." Silence, that's the price paid. The bargain is struck. Alina didn't understand. Not then. She spent a fitful night, haunted by the image of that abyss, the silent stones. In the gray light of dawn, the village stirred. The ordinary sounds of life returned, but muted, cautious. Relief warred with unease. Had she done it? Had her scream somehow sealed the rift? It was mid-morning when the knocking came. A frantic pounding on the inn door. Mrs. Byron opened it to find young Davy Mac ready, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "It's Lily," he sobbed. "Little Lily Ferguson. She's gone. We were playing by the burn, she just vanished. 1 minute she was there, picking flowers, next gone. We heard whispering, common from the old yew tree near the wheeled edge. Eleanor S. blood turned to ice. Lily. The innkeeper S. bride-tide, 6-year-old granddaughter, the one who shyly offered Eleanor a wild flower. Yesterday she ran. They all ran, following Davy to the spot near the brook, just where the black weald began its encroachment. There, trampled in the mud, were Lily S. tiny footprints. They led towards the ancient, gnarled yew tree that stood sentinel at the forest edge, and there, caught on a low, skeletal branch, was a scrap of blue fabric from Lily S. dress at the base of the yew tree, partially obscured by moss and fallen needles. The earth was disturbed, not dug, but sunken, as if something heavy had been pulled down into it and etched crudely into the bark of the tree, as if by frantic, tiny fingernails, was a single word. Quiet Leaner sank to her knees, the horrifying realization crashing over her. Her scream hadn't sealed the rift. It had been the answer the stones, or the entity they bound, had been waiting for. Not a word of appeasement, but a sound of pure terror, a sound that marked the sacrifice. The ritual hadn't been completed. It had been circumvented. The ancient bargain demanded by an TSL Og, a life for silence, for its return to slumber, had been fulfilled, not by the keeper S. blood on the stones, but by the taking of an innocent. Her scream had been the inadvertent signal, the acceptance of the terms. She looked up at the Cairnhold stones, visible on the moor in the distance, silent, implacable. She imagined the whispering would return, eventually, when the hunger stirred again, and the crow woman would walk once more, a silent, dreadful herald. The stones had stood for millennia. They would stand long after Eleanor was dust. The horror wasn't vanquished. It was merely postponed, its appetite temporarily sated by a child S. stolen breath as the villagers gathered, their cries of grief mixing with the sighing wind. Eleanor thought she heard, carried from the silent stones, or perhaps from the depths of the black weald itself, the faintest, most terrible sound of all. Not a whisper, not a scream, but the soft, satisfied sound of something ancient and ravenous, settling back into its dark bed, and beneath the morning wails of Cairnhold, beneath the wind in the pines, she knew the stones were waiting. The bargain, written in blood and forgotten lore, stood eternal, and somewhere in the vast, indifferent dark beneath the world, Lily Ferguson was learning the true meaning of silence. The Crow Woman was watching. She would always be watching. The stones would whisper again, and Cairnhold would remember, too late, the price of ignoring the warnings from the deep past.